he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. This is one of the most well-known but least understood quotes by Friedrich Nietzsche. The big problem is that it sounds vague yet profound enough for anyone to give it any interpretation they please. In this video, we'll attempt an explanation based on Nietzsche's entire body of work, and we'll explore just how much meaning there is to be found in such a short sentence. The answer is going to take us into the dark, uncharted depths of the human soul. So, strap in, grab some coffee, black of course, and enjoy the ride. We find this quote in Beyond Good and Evil, which is in itself a notoriously difficult book. It's also presented to us without context. The aphorism stands alone, sandwiched between two unrelated quotes about women. And Nietzsche wrote the following about the art of aphorism in general. An aphorism properly coined and cast into its final mold is far from being deciphered as soon as it has been read. On the contrary, it is then that it first requires to be expounded. Of course, for that purpose, an art of exposition is necessary. In this video, we will attempt just that, an exposition. Hopefully, the citation also makes clear that Nietzsche did mean something profound by it, and that he wasn't trying to just come up with a witty-sounding quote that doesn't really mean anything. Join us as we venture deep into the darkness, into the abyss, and see what we find there. What does it mean for the abyss to gaze into you? We are going into uncharted territory here, exploring unknown lands. It's better to go prepared. And what better way to prepare yourself than by topping up on some knowledge with Brilliant, the sponsor of today's video. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. What I enjoy so much about Brilliant is how they focus on teaching you first principles in an interactive way. Not only is it more engaging than simply watching lecture videos, it's also more effective to make you remember it all. Moreover, Brilliant makes it easy to incorporate learning into your daily routine, which is, after all, the most important part of taking charge of your own education. Get the habit started and stay consistent with it. My personal favorites are the logic courses as well as the scientific thinking course, both of which are essential for anyone looking to learn philosophy. Logic is traditionally one of the harder philosophical subdisciplines, but Brilliant's interactive learning makes it fun and gives you puzzles to solve as you progress. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Weltgeist or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now, back to Nietzsche. The fact that the voice which speaks in my works is that of a psychologist who has not his peer is perhaps the first conclusion at which a good reader will arrive. Nietzsche, perhaps more than a philosopher, considered himself a psychologist, someone who looked into the minds and souls of men, cultures, and epochs. In a way, his entire philosophical project is about laying bare these hidden psychological layers. Much of Beyond Good and Evil is concerned with what Nietzsche calls the prejudices of philosophers, and it's in Beyond Good and Evil, the very same book in which the aphorism of the abyss appears, that Nietzsche most explicitly talks about his so-called perspectivism, the idea that a person's philosophy is informed not by the quality of their thought, but by their health, by their personality, and most of all, their psychological constitution. This is why Nietzsche is often grouped in with Marx and Freud as one of the three so-called masters of suspicion of the 20th century, because he looks beyond the surface and reveals the inner machinations of the spirit and exposes the false consciousness that plagues mankind. We think we know why we think what we think, having arrived at our opinions in a straightforward, rational manner, but actually, hidden forces are at play. In Freud, it's the unconscious and the libidinal drive. In Marx, it's the material conditions that inform our worldview. And in Nietzsche, well, we'll get to that. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche's autobiography, he analyzes his own talents and character. When he discusses his talent for psychology, we get our first clue as to the meaning of this mysterious aphorism. I can ascertain physiologically, that is to say, smell, the proximity, nay, the inmost core, the entrails of every human soul. This sensitiveness of mine is furnished with psychological antennae wherewith I feel and grasp every secret, the quality of concealed filth lying at the base of many a human character. Smells, entrails, filth, all lying at the base of many a human character. Yet we should be careful not to take these connotations and these words too literally. Nietzsche is more complicated than that. And since we are reading Ecce Homo, we must always keep in mind that the entire work has a slight tone of irony and exaggeration within it. Let's revisit the passage again, and this time put the emphasis on other words than smell, entrails, and filth. Inmost core, human soul, secret, concealed. Nietzsche is deliberately playing with the connotation of words here. Yes, the word entrails is associated with disgust, gore, nastiness, but also, cleverly, entrails are hidden. They are beyond the surface. They are hidden behind an exterior layer. Entrails and organs are the hidden mechanism behind how our body works, protected by outer layers of skin and muscle, which are associated with beauty and strength. In effect, what Nietzsche is saying here, somewhat poetically, with the extended metaphor of concealed filth and entrails, is that at the base of every human, behind the outer shell, the nice exterior, lays an obscure, hidden, filthy, unsightly core, and it's this core that actually constitutes the bulk of our being. Yet it's also this core, in Nietzsche's view, that has been overlooked by psychologists and philosophers alike. And it's Nietzsche, with his psychological antennae, who is uniquely equipped to tell us more about this mysterious hidden layer. Let's explore deeper. What makes Nietzsche so confident about his abilities? Another passage in Ecce Homo sheds some light on this. The fact that the voice which speaks in my works is that of a psychologist who has not his peer is perhaps the first conclusion at which a good reader will arrive. Next, he fires off a series of assertions. He does not give arguments for them. He assumes that the reader agrees with him, but we'll look at them in more detail, don't worry. Nietzsche considers himself the best psychologist because he sees through a series of blunders with which seemingly everyone agrees. Everyone except Nietzsche, that is. That's what makes him the best. These blunders are the belief that altruistic and egoistic are opposites, while all the time the ego itself is merely a supreme swindle, an ideal. The proposition that man pursues happiness, or the proposition that happiness is the reward of virtue, or the proposition that pleasure and pain are opposites. The terribly nonsensical point of calling love unselfish. A big theme in these blunders, as Nietzsche calls them, is the duality present in them. Egoism versus altruism, pleasure versus pain. Nietzsche seeks to go beyond these simple oppositions, but not in a Hegelian way where they are subsumed into each other and transcend the duality, but in a characteristically Nietzschean way. He seeks to not go above like Hegel, but below, into the depths, into the abyss. Hegel believed in the slow march of the Geist, where opposites cancel each other out, as it were, where every concept also gives birth to its opposite, and in the interplay between the two reach a third state, a higher state. For example, being and non-being turn into becoming. But Nietzsche takes the opposite route. Where Hegel seems to point towards heaven, Nietzsche points towards hell. Nietzsche calls us back to the primordial state of affairs, of loose, unconnected being, to the time before mummified concepts ruled our thinking, as it does in Hegel. Before good and evil took over the world as polar opposites, with the one being virtuous and the other being nefarious. It's in this primordial chaos, the eternal flux of Heraclitus, that Nietzsche seeks our psychological origins. And in grasping this mindset lies the secret of going beyond good and evil. To understand this more deeply, let's take a look at one of Nietzsche's favorite cultures, the Greeks. It might not make sense to turn to the Greeks to explain his psychology, but bear with me, it will all make sense soon enough. One of the things that has always puzzled me about the Greeks is their admiration for Odysseus. It's easy to see why the Greeks would valorize Achilles, the protagonist from the Iliad, a demigod with a thirst for glory and vengeance, the perfect soldier who meets a glorious end in battle. But what about Odysseus, the protagonist from the Odyssey? Whereas Achilles is mainly known for his rage and courage and martial prowess, Odysseus is known for his cunning and capacity to trick people. This always struck me as weird. Wouldn't this make Odysseus a coward, unworthy of emulation? Yes, Odysseus does his fair share of fighting and braving the seas in the Odyssey, but one defining part of his character is how he is an intelligent trickster who manages to escape from trouble via lying and deceit. The famous episode with the Cyclops comes to mind, where Odysseus tricks the Cyclops Polyphemus, attacks him in his sleep, and then makes a run for it by tying himself and his crewmates to the underbelly of a flock of sheep. But of course, the crowning achievement of Odysseus is his invention of the Trojan horse, which put an end to the Trojan War, not through noble battle, but by exploiting the gullibility and hubris of the Trojans, and by surprise attacking them under the cover of night. And the Greeks considered Odysseus a hero. Isn't that strange? The Romans seem to share my opinion. Considering themselves descendants of Aeneas, Prince of Troy, they regarded Odysseus as a lying coward who lacked the Roman concept of honor. Virgil often calls Odysseus deceitful, cruel, and sly in the Aeneid. Yet the Greeks regarded Odysseus as a hero, cunning and all. There's even a Platonic dialogue called Hippias Minor, where Socrates and a sophist argue about which of the two Homeric heroes are the greatest, Odysseus or Achilles. In the end, they remain undecided. To the Romans, Achilles was preferable to Odysseus. He won his battles through martial prowess. He doesn't lie, he doesn't cheat. He fights and he wins, fair and square. Odysseus, on the other hand, wins through tricks and traps. In the Middle Ages, too, we can deduce that Odysseus wasn't regarded as a role model. Dante, for example, has him appear in the 8th circle of hell, the circle of fraud, where he appears as an eternally burning flame, punished for his deception of the Trojans by coming up with the scheme of the Trojan horse. But we don't need all these elaborate references. It's quite obvious, especially today, that we prefer someone who wins through sheer bravery and strength to someone who wins through guile and deceit. And yet, for the Greeks, the wit and resourcefulness of Odysseus were seen as virtues. The question that is of interest to us must therefore be, why? What is it about the Greek spirit that sees virtue in deception, in lying, in being, what some would say, a coward? And more importantly, what changed? This question also bothered Nietzsche, who had a lifelong fascination for the Greeks and what he called the Greek spirit, which is so very different from our own, us Western moderns, who have been molded by 2000 years of philosophy, science, but most of all, Christianity. Because of this, at least according to Nietzsche, the Greek world appears as something so strange, so foreign, so violent and brutal, that to truly understand the Greek mindset and to see the world through Greek eyes is a momentous task. Not only do we need to have the mental fortitude and intelligence to pretend for a second that Christian morality does not exist, a religion, after all, entirely foreign to the Greeks, but foundational to our current culture. We also need to view the Greeks through a pre-philosophical lens. What do we mean by this? Generally, when Nietzsche talks about the Greeks, he talks about the Greeks who lived before the time of Socrates and Plato. As we have elaborated in other videos, most notably why Nietzsche hated Socrates, for Nietzsche, Greek culture was already in decline by the time Socrates the Athenian appeared on the scene. And this decline was accelerated when the Greeks embraced a Socratic philosophy and method of reasoning. And after Socrates came Plato. And with Plato, things changed forever. Plato introduced a duality to the world. His theory of forms posited that the material world, the world of the here and now, is not the world of supreme importance. This world is but a shadow, an imperfect reflection of the world of forms. The philosopher, Plato argues, should not concern himself with the material world, but with the world of forms. When we think about the good, when we think about the ideal of the good, it exists not here on earth, but in idealized version in the world of forms. All of this philosophy had a profound psychological effect on the culture and worldview of the Greeks. Now there is a difference, a profound difference, between appearance and reality. Nietzsche's argument is that the pre-Socratic Greeks looked at the world in a different way than we do, because they were unburdened by this conceptual difference between what appears and what is. This is why he said Thucydides is the antidote to Plato. Thucydides is an Athenian historian famous for his blunt descriptions of the physical reality of history. The motivations of the historical characters in his History of the Peloponnesian War are rooted in human, power-hungry, egotistical desires. For Thucydides, the material world is the be-all and end-all. He confronts reality head-on, including all the ugly parts of human nature. Plato, by contrast, can always hide behind his world of forms. This is why Nietzsche provocatively calls Plato a coward. He doesn't have the courage to face reality head-on and deal with the ugly aspects of humanity and nature. He can find psychological comfort by turning his eyes away from the world and to contemplate the forms in all their idealistic glory, far removed from anything resembling material reality. So to reiterate, with Socrates and Plato, this distinction between appearance, the material world, and reality, the world of forms, becomes manifest. It seems as if the real world, the world of flesh and bone, water and earth, sun and moon, was suddenly exposed as being fake, a cheap imitation of the actual real world, the world of forms. It is the task of the philosopher, says Plato, to concern himself with the forms, and not with the material. Thucydides, writing before Plato came onto the scene, makes no such distinction between appearance and reality yet. For Thucydides, what you see is what you get. It's literally a different way of looking at the world. For Thucydides, this world is all we have. We have to make do with it. We have to confront it head-on, for better or for worse. There is no alternative. So for Nietzsche, Thucydides is a much more perfect Greek than Plato. In Nietzsche's view of history, Plato's world of forms will eventually morph into Christianity, with the heavenly afterlife taking the place of the Platonic world of forms. Hence his famous quip that Christianity is Platonism for the people. Alright, let's take a step back. So Plato introduced this fundamental duality in philosophy and culture, the idea of appearance versus reality. And Greeks who lived before Socrates and Plato looked at reality without this duality in mind. To them, appearance was reality. What does all of this have to do with Odysseus? Remember, we got started on this tangent to answer the question why the Greeks held Odysseus in such high esteem, even though, by Roman standards, and maybe even modern standards, he appears to us as a coward who has to win not through honest fighting, but through tricks and traps. Well, a trick, in other words, a lie, needs a truth. When Odysseus devises the plan for the Trojan horse, it's offered to the Trojans as a present and symbol of Greek surrender. Obviously, they don't tell them about the small legion of Greek soldiers hidden inside. They lie about the horse. They present it as something that it is not. In the 21st century, and basically for the last 2000 years as well, this type of deception is seen as either cowardly or dishonorable, and at best only justified if it's done in service of some greater benefit. For example, defeating the Trojans. But this is where the Greek mindset, which Nietzsche is almost begging us to try and understand, is at odds with the modern mindset, influenced by Plato and Christianity. The whole point is the following. For the Greek pre-modern way of looking at the world, there is simply no such a strong dividing line between truth and falsehood, between deception and honesty, between a ruse and an honorable battle. We look at something like the truth, and there is already the truth, and our conception of truth is entirely and thoroughly Platonic. We conceptualize the truth as this thing that exists somewhere, independent of our material reality. As the saying goes, the truth is out there. We view the truth as something separate from the world, existing in its own realm, and if the material reality corresponds to that ideal, then we say something is truthful. Just like how Plato would argue that we can recognize a chair as a chair because it participates in the idea of chairness. We recognize truth by comparing and checking how well it corresponds to this idea of truth with capital T. This process, in the modern Western world, happens so quickly, unconsciously and effortlessly that we don't even notice it. But when we put the truth under a microscope, this is what we see. And we also find a piece of the puzzle to unmask another difficult part of Nietzsche's philosophy, his crusade against truth. As he writes in the Genealogy of Morals, "From the minute that the belief in the God of the aesthetic ideal is repudiated, when we recognize Platonism is false, there exists a new problem, the problem of the value of truth. The will for truth needed a critique. Let us define by these words our own task. The value of truth is tentatively to be called in question." We will go into this in another video. Subscribe if you want to be notified when we release it, and follow us on Twitter in case YouTube neglects to notify you. So, what separates us from the Greeks is that we have this idealistic view of looking at the world, of thinking about concepts as having this independent existence, as being somewhere. The truth is out there. It is its own entity. And by looking at the material world and seeing how well things respond to this entity, we assign a truth value to it. We are all so heavily indebted to this Platonic way of looking at the world that we barely notice its influence. As Emerson said, Plato taught us how to think. But the trouble doesn't stop there, because who cares if the truth is out there somewhere or not? What difference does it make? Well, in Platonic philosophy, there is such a thing as the supreme good, the form of the good, goodness itself. And just like the idea or form of a chair emanates from its chairness in the material world, the good also emanates good things. In fact, the form of the good is the source of all other forms, including the truth. Just as a chair participates in chairness, the truth participates in the good. Philosophically, this is Plato's justification for why the truth is preferable to falsehood, because it quite literally, by definition, is a part of the good. Psychologically and culturally, this philosophy had a massive and perhaps unprecedented influence on how the coming 2 millennia would view the world and relate themselves to such ideas as the truth, the good, the just, and the beautiful. All of these things participate in the supreme good, and therefore are all linked with each other. What is true is good. What is good is true. Therefore, a lie is bad, because it's not true, and therefore not good. This is why the Romans, living comfortably in post-Platonic times, regarded Odysseus and his tricks as cowardly and dishonorable. They had been influenced by the Platonic way of looking at things. And that is also why the pre-Platonic Greeks, including Thucydides, admired Odysseus for those very same tricks that the Romans called cowardly. What was a vice for the Romans was a virtue for the Greeks. Because the Greeks lived on one side of a dividing line and the Romans on another. And that dividing line is Plato and his idea of the world of forms, which changed how we think about good and evil forever. The pre-Platonic Greeks simply didn't think about things in this way. To them, appearance was reality, because Plato hadn't come up with the forms yet. Appearance was reality. The line between a lie and truth didn't exist as we think of it today, and to lie was not this big immoral act, not an affront to the supreme good, because the supreme good wasn't conceived of yet. All that Odysseus did in coming up with the Trojan horse was a way to affect real results in the real, actual, material world. It didn't offend the supreme good because the supreme good wasn't invented yet. And of course, careful viewers of the channel have already figured out that according to Nietzsche, this supreme good of Plato would eventually morph into the God of Christianity. Lying in Christianity is a sin because it offends God. Because all truth originates in God, just like all truth originates in the supreme good in Plato. Let's tie it all together with the following passage from Nietzsche's underrated book Daybreak, where he talks about the Greek ideal. The Greek ideal. What did the Greeks admire in Odysseus? Above all, his capacity for lying and for cunning and terrible retribution, his being equal to contingencies, when need be, appearing nobler than the noblest, the ability to be whatever he chose, heroic perseverance, having all means at his command, possession of intellect. His intellect is the admiration of the gods. They smile when they think of it. All this is the Greek ideal. The most remarkable thing about it is that the antithesis of appearance and being is not felt at all, and is thus of no significance morally. So, in essence, to bring it all back, lying was simply not that big of a deal to the Greeks. Was all of this exposition necessary just to get to that simple point? Actually, yes, because it requires from us in the 21st century a mindset shift that many people simply can't get around unless every step of the thinking process is laid out clearly, much like how a math equation is only a simple line of symbols, but sometimes needs multiple hours of explanation before it really clicks and before you actually get it. Now that we understand how to look at the Greeks with Nietzschean eyes, we are more equipped to understand the aphorism that this entire video is about, in case you forgot. Like I said at the start, Nietzsche believes an aphorism is not understood on its first reading, and an art of exposition is necessary to really understand him. So let's continue on with our quest. We needed to understand the Greek way of looking at reality to deeply understand one of Nietzsche's biggest philosophical pet peeves. We've already alluded to it at the start of the video, and it's in the title of one of his most famous works, Beyond Good and Evil. A recurring theme throughout Nietzsche's works is his distaste of what he calls false opposites. It can be hard to wrap your head around what exactly he is getting at, and the paragraphs railing against false opposites, most of which appear in Beyond Good and Evil, are also the most difficult parts of the book. Luckily, we spent the last few minutes preparing ourselves, because what Nietzsche really wants us to do is to tap into this Greek view of the world. When we do this, when we leave behind Platonism and Christianity and the modus operandi where we view the truth as something existing beyond the material world, as this unchanging, eternal idea that is out there somewhere, just waiting to be found, then we raise a dangerous question. Nietzsche says there is perhaps no greater risk. We start to question the value of truth. Granted that we want the truth, why not rather untruth? And uncertainty, even ignorance, the problem of the value of truth presented itself to us. Or was it we who presented ourselves before the problem? Indeed, most people take it on an article of faith as a matter of definition almost, that the truth is preferable to falsehood. But why? For Nietzsche, the fact that we never ask ourselves this question is proof that the Platonic philosophy turned Christian theology has completely penetrated our ways of thinking and looking at the world. But we don't live in Platonic and Christian times any longer. God is dead, and with that we lost much more than simply religion. We must be prepared to take its conclusion all the way to asking ourselves the forbidden question: what is the value of truth? And why not rather untruth? The metaphysicians, the philosophers, have all been gravely mistaken. The fundamental belief of metaphysicians is the belief in antitheses of values. It never occurred, even to the wariest of them, to doubt here on the very threshold, where doubt, however, was most necessary, though they had made a solemn vow, de omnibus dubitandum, to doubt everything. Here we descend into philosophical darkness, but Nietzsche gives us a light. He asks the reader, what if everything is wrong? In spite of all the value which may belong to the true, the positive, and the unselfish, it might be possible that a higher and more fundamental value for life generally should be assigned to pretense, to the will, to delusion, to selfishness, to cupidity. It might even be possible that what constitutes the value of those good and respected things consists precisely in their being insidiously related, knotted, and crocheted to those evil and apparently opposed things. Perhaps even in being essentially identical with them. Perhaps. This is our first look into the abyss. We are going boldly where no philosopher has gone before. We will return to this passage in due time. For the time being, suffice to say that Nietzsche puts a gigantic question mark next to these prejudices of the philosophers, as he calls them. Is it really so simple that in the world we have truth versus lie, good versus evil, egoistic versus altruistic? When we propose these contradictions, Are we really getting at the true kernel of reality, or are we simply making our best educated guess as to how the world really works? Plato arguably had a well thought out philosophical system to sustain his belief in these pairs of opposites. Truth is preferred to falsehood because truth participates in the idea of the supreme good, and falsehood does not. And Christian religion too could sustain this belief. Truth is opposed to falsehood because truth comes directly from God, and falsehood does not. Easy peasy. But let's be honest, we stopped believing in these things. Yet, the belief in these opposites, the belief that truth is the opposite of falsehood, and above all, that truth is preferable to falsehood, continues to live on. Why? We simply take it on faith. Nietzsche is the first to courageously put the question, what if it's all wrong? This whole what if of Nietzsche is of course dangerous. It has the potential to completely upset the way we think and look at the world. Who knows what will come out of these investigations into the value of truth? We may not like what we find. Who knows what lies at the bottom of the abyss? But who wishes to concern himself with such dangerous what-ifs? For that investigation, one must await the advent of a new order of philosophers, such as will have other tastes and inclinations, the reverse of those hitherto prevalent, philosophers of the dangerous. Cue the subtitle of Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. But what about a psychology of the future? As we mentioned at the start of the video, Nietzsche saw himself as a psychologist first and foremost, and he boasted of his extraordinary talent in this domain. Just like Nietzsche argued against the existence of oppositions in his philosophy, with the truth with a capital T starting to live a life of its own due to the influence of Plato, he also argues against the existence of oppositions in psychology. And just like the pre-Platonic Greeks didn't see a meaningful difference between appearance and reality, between lie and truth, between egoism and altruism, so too our psychology of the future must be pre-Platonic in scope. In other words, we must look again beyond good and evil, only not now in a metaphysical sense, but in a psychological one. And just like the pre-Platonic Greek view of morality might confuse or even shock us, with its unashamed depictions of violence, thirst for revenge, and glory at all costs, so too this new psychology, unburdened by Platonism, might confuse and shock us. But what would this psychology look like? Here Nietzsche remains largely silent. Remember, we are staring into the abyss. And Beyond Good and Evil is subtitled A Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. Nietzsche puts us on the path, but won't take us to the destination. To get there, wherever that may be, is the task of the so-called free spirits of the future, and ostensibly, all of this trouble will culminate in the mythical Übermensch. However, Nietzsche did drop some hints, so let's explore those. Let's circle back to the start of the video, to the passage we quoted earlier from Ecce Homo. These are the so-called blunders of the psychologists that Nietzsche takes issue with. The belief that altruistic and egoistic are opposites, while all the time the ego itself is merely a supreme swindle, an ideal. The proposition that man pursues a happiness, or the proposition that happiness is the reward of virtue, or the proposition that pleasure and pain are opposites. The terribly nonsensical point of calling love unselfish. Hopefully, after all this time, it's become very clear what Nietzsche's problem is with these blunders. The main thing he is railing against is the perceived opposition between all these terms. The so-called opposition between altruistic and egoistic, for example. He even calls the ego itself an ideal, harkening back to Platonism as this mummified concept, this idea that seems to have an independent existence, when in actual fact, it's simply an outgrowth of our Platonic way of thinking, of us trying to capture the myriad of phenomena of the world into a neat little thing that we call a concept. In Twilight of the Idols, we can read Nietzsche's main antagonism to this Platonic way of thinking, in a chapter entirely dedicated to so-called reason in philosophy. The metaphor of mummified concepts is deliberate, as Nietzsche believes that Plato studied in ancient Egypt and developed much of his philosophy in accordance with the Egyptian way of thinking, which thinks in terms of being as opposed to becoming, Concepts are not in flux. They are frozen in time. They are mummified. You ask me what all idiosyncrasy is in philosophers. For instance, their lack of the historical sense, their hatred even of the idea of becoming, their Egyptianism. They imagine that they do honor to a thing by divorcing it from history sub specie aeterni, when they make a mummy of it. All the ideas that philosophers have treated for thousands of years have been mummied concepts. Nothing real has ever come out of their hands alive. This is the great error at the heart of philosophy, and consequently, psychology. This eternal belief in being, the enduring bias that things must exist of themselves and have an independent quality to them, divorced from death, change, age, as well as procreation and growth. By contrast, Nietzsche proposed a philosophy based on becoming, opposed to being, preferring Heraclitus to Parmenides and Plato. Not Egyptian, but Greek. Real Greek. Greek philosophy before the Socratic Platonic revolution. Insofar as the senses show us a state of becoming, of transiency, and of change, they do not lie. But in declaring that being was an empty illusion, Heraclitus will remain eternally right. Philosophers seem obsessed with capturing these concepts, and in accordance with Plato, give them these high-sounding names like the absolute, truth, beauty, justice, and the good. They reason that these things must exist somewhere, and it's up to us to uncover them. They must have this mummified existence. They must be this treasure that is just waiting to be discovered. Finding the treasure, that is the philosopher's task. Nietzsche puts a question mark next to this way of thinking, unmasking it as a remnant of Platonic thought. It's time to honestly re-evaluate this philosophical project and look at things with fresh eyes, with pre-Platonic eyes, with Greek eyes, not with Egyptian eyes. Philosophers, up until Nietzsche's time, have thought from the top down. In the beginning, there is God, or, as in Plato, the good. Downstream from God and the good, we get concepts like beauty, truth, justice. Lower still, psychological concepts, like the ego. And then all the way at the bottom, we have the material world, where things imperfectly correspond to these high ideals. Things can be beautiful, but true, absolute beauty with a capital B is this concept itself, and a material object can never attain this quality of being perfectly beautiful. As Nietzsche says, philosophers have it all backwards. They put the last concept first. God as the cause of all things, the highest being, when it's literally the opposite. The material world is the essence of things. It's where we have to start. And if we can rid ourselves of our Platonic glasses, we can see the world for how it really is. A mismatch of becoming, things striving against one another, imperfection, change, death, growth, error, deception. For Nietzsche, error is as fundamental as truth, because they are both simply things that exist in the world. In fact, we fall into a Platonic trap of sorts if we too strictly separate the two, because in Nietzsche's view of looking at things, reality itself is simply this primordial soup of competing drives. Truth and falsehood are poisoned words, because we cannot help but attach a Platonic connotation to them, where the truth is somehow better than falsehood. Nietzsche shies away from these distinctions. Nothing indeed has exercised a more simple power of persuasion hitherto than the error of being, as it was formulated by the Eleatics, for instance. In its favor are every word and every sentence that we utter. Even the opponents of the Eleatics succumbed to the seductive powers of their concept of being. The first step towards a psychology of the future, a psychology beyond the abyss, is to rid ourselves of this seductive power of being and embrace becoming. It involves seeing the world, and not just the world, but our psyche, as existing of competing drives, a philosophy of things in eternal flux, like a flowing river that changes with the seasons. Any attempt to capture a singular moment, a thing of substance, and give it the status of a concept is to fall into the trap of being, of trying to mummify something, trying to find stability and tranquility amidst a sea of storm and change. Most of all, it involves us getting rid of the persistent illusion that things exist in pairs of polar opposites. Truth versus lie, altruism versus egoism, good versus evil, and appearance versus reality. We must embrace reality as it presents itself to us in all its multifariousness, not like Plato, hide behind concepts and ideals. That was Plato's cowardice, according to Nietzsche. facing the multiplicity of reality and trying to systematize and simplify this mosaic of variation by capturing things and categorizing them according to forms, taking something as complex as the material world and trying to reduce it to a schematic, as if reality is something to be conquered by our reason so that we can map it out, make it not seem so scary, foreign, and unknown. The dark, ugly, scary, unknown, and dangerous parts of reality are just as much to be reckoned with as the beautiful, the just, the truthful, and the explored parts. Reality is a constantly changing, ever-flowing river that does not let itself be tamed by human reason. The world is much richer than that, and a true philosophy, someone who bravely ventures beyond good and evil, must confront also these subterranean, hidden, dangerous parts. In other words, a true psychologist must also become an expert in entrails, the ugly machinations that we don't like to confront because they might disgust us. We must smell the filth. Like the quote at the start of the video, I can ascertain physiologically, that is to say, smell, the proximity, nay, the inmost core, the entrails of every human soul. This sensitiveness of mine is furnished with psychological antennae wherewith I feel and grasp every secret, the quality of concealed filth lying at the base of many a human character. This ugliness of the human soul, the concealed filth lying at bottom of our human character, cannot simply be explained away as mere ignorance or a lack of understanding or justice, as a deficient, imperfect Platonic form, as a second-rate instantiation of some glorious Platonic ideal that exists somewhere. No, we have done away with Platonic ideals and Platonic ways of thinking, and the entrails lay before us. We have no recourse now. We must confront them fully and honestly, and let's not make excuses for them and blame the imperfect material world for not being a perfect representation of some Platonic other world. We must look into our own souls, beyond the appearance, beyond the surface, and into the abyss. We might not like what we find there. That is why, in the full quote, Nietzsche says that he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. This psychological process involves looking deep into your own soul and confronting whatever darkness lies there, as it lies everywhere for all mankind. One of the things we have to reckon with, for example, is our innate desire to inflict cruelty. When Nietzsche warns us that if we stare into the abyss, it gazes back, he is saying that when we peer deep into the human psyche, we might encounter a kind of darkness for which we are not prepared. We have shackled off the influence of Plato, under whose influence reality was neatly arranged in pairs of opposites, good and evil, beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice, truth and falsehood. The philosopher, Plato argued, should focus on the forms of the good that permeate our reality, as this brings us closer to the good, and this is the best way for things to be, by definition. The philosopher, therefore, must focus on the good, on beauty, on justice, and on truth, as these things bring him closer to the supreme good. Evil, ugliness, injustice, and falsehood are just the absence of these good things. They are imperfect representations of the supreme good, damaged copies of a perfect original. They are not worth our time. But with Nietzsche, there is no binary choice between good and evil or beauty and ugliness. It all comes in a single package, a package called reality. There is no dividing line anymore. If we want beauty, we must reckon with ugliness. And if we want the truth, we must reckon with falsehood. And if the abyss gazes back, well, we must confront this darkness, this monster lurking beneath the depths, and in the process of doing so, take care that we ourselves do not become monsters, that we do not let the darkness of the abyss consume us. But reckon with it we must, and so let's take a look at one of the most striking examples of human darkness that Nietzsche uncovers: our lust for cruelty. Of course, Nietzsche is not the first philosopher to point out that humans are very good at being cruel. But philosophers of the past would have hand-waved away humanity's capacity for inflicting cruelty as the result of being in a fallen world. In other words, we are not fundamentally cruel, but we are made cruel by circumstance. In Socrates and Plato, cruelty stems from ignorance. Those who are cruel simply do not understand the nature of justice, and they are misled. If only philosophers could educate them, then their desire to inflict cruelty would disappear on its own. Later on, in Christianity, The evil side of mankind is explained away by our existence in a fallen world brought about by Adam and Eve's original sin. We are made perfectly good in God's image, but evil found its way into the world when Adam and Eve took that fatal bite and were banished from paradise. Interestingly, in the modern era, the Enlightenment thinkers largely went back to the Socratic Platonic conception of evil, where injustice is merely the result of a lack of education or brought about by extenuating circumstances. If only criminals and psychopaths would embrace philosophy and reason, they would quickly see the error of their ways and make amends. Nietzsche says, no, the desire to inflict cruelty, the rush of power when we dominate others, it's baked into the cake. It's who we are as a species, and rather than explain it away as some accident or manufacturing mistake, we should embrace it as an integral part of what makes us human. That is the darkness that Nietzsche metaphorically describes with language like entrails, or what he calls the layer of concealed filth that lies at heart of many a human soul. The dark parts of the soul that we have difficulty confronting, the parts of the soul that lie the deepest, buried as they are under pleasant lies or petty justifications. So much of Nietzsche's philosophy comes together here. In Beyond Good and Evil, he talks about the need for a psychology of the depths. This is what he's talking about. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he tells mankind it needs to become more evil. This is what he's talking about. And in The Joyful Science, he first proposes at length a theory of power, where the concept of power is deeply tied up with the human capacity for inflicting cruelty, both on ourselves and on others. We exercise our power over others by doing them good or by doing them ill. That is all we care for. Doing ill to those on whom we have to make our power felt, for pain is a far more sensitive means for that purpose than pleasure. Even if we do good to others, we only do so because it heightens our own feeling of power. When we help someone, we are subconsciously telling them, I have the power to help you. You are dependent on me, and you exist because of me, and that gives me power over you. Doing good and being kind to those who are in any way already dependent on us, that is, who are accustomed to think of us as their raison d'être, we want to increase their power because we thus increase our own. Or we want to show them the advantage there is in being in our power. They thus become more contented with their position and more hostile to the enemies of our power. Nietzsche unmasks the supposed altruistic motives behind charity, the nice story we like to tell ourselves of why we help our fellow man, and looks beneath the surface to reveal the same human, all too human motivations for doing what we do. Increase our power. Again, he uses his psychological antennae to reveal the concealed filth lying at the base of many a human character. Even the philosopher himself is not safe from this psychological investigation. Even the solitary philosopher sitting alone in his cabin in the woods, crafting a system of metaphysics all by himself, not bothering anyone, not hurting anyone, he is still beholden to his desire for power, because what could be more powerful than possessing the truth? He who under these circumstances feels that he is in possession of truth, how many possessions does he not let go in order to preserve this feeling? What does he not throw overboard in order to keep himself up, that is to say, above the others who lack the truth? The idea that the primary motivation for human beings, if not the only motivation, is power, is an idea that will later morph into the infamous will to power, where Nietzsche will argue that the need for power can even override the instinct for life preservation itself. In fact, he already alludes to this idea right here in The Joyful Science when he speaks of martyrdom. If we make sacrifices in doing good or in doing ill, it does not alter the ultimate value of our actions. Even if we stake our life in the cause as martyrs for the sake of our church, it is a sacrifice to our longing for power, or for the purpose of conserving our sense of power. This is perhaps something we would not like to admit. That deep down, we are all power-hungry Machiavellians. That beneath the outer layer of civility, virtue, and kindness lie such base motivations as the ordinary thirst for power. But it's something we have to contend with if we are to be honest psychologists who dare to go deep and who dare to gaze into the abyss. As Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, all psychology hitherto has run aground on moral prejudices and timidities. It has not dared to launch out into the depths. These moral prejudices and timidities of which Nietzsche speaks are precisely the parts that we traditionally would designate as the bad parts of our psyche, the shadow side, the abyss, perhaps even the monstrous side. Because gazing into the abyss is one thing. However, the full quote reads that he who fights with monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster. And not only should we gaze into the abyss, we must be prepared, because the abyss gazes back. The meaning of this second part of the quote is found in the fact that Nietzsche seems to think that such a project, this psychology of the depths, would lead to the destruction of the old moralities that have hitherto guided Western civilization. Nietzsche warns us that up until himself, no psychologist so far has ventured into the unknown seas of this new morality, instead getting shipwrecked on the rocks of the moral prejudices of the time, which seem, at least until Nietzsche arrives onto the scene, inescapable. The power of moral prejudices has penetrated deeply into the most intellectual world, the world apparently most indifferent and unprejudiced, and has obviously operated in an injurious, obstructive, blinding, and distorting manner. The person who succeeds in thinking clearly and honestly and confronting the concealed filth at the base of many human character is in for a rough ride indeed. If, however, a person should regard even the emotions of hatred, envy, covetousness, and imperiousness as life-conditioning emotions, as factors which must be present fundamentally and essentially in the general economy of life, which must, therefore, be further developed, if life is to be further developed, he will suffer from such a view of things as from seasickness. This right here is the meat of the matter. Rather than putting away emotions such as hatred and envy, explaining them away as character defects, we should embrace them as necessary parts of the cultivation of life. And if we enjoy life at all, then the cultivation of these quote-unquote bad emotions must necessarily be part of a healthy organism. A brief example can be of service here. An aphorism dedicated to one of the men Nietzsche admired the most, Cesare Borgia. The beast of prey and the man of prey, for instance, Cesare Borgia, are fundamentally misunderstood. Nature is misunderstood, so long as one seeks a morbidness in the constitution of these healthiest of all tropical monsters and growths, or even an innate hell in them, as almost all moralists have done hitherto. Does it not seem that there is a hatred of the virgin forest and of the tropics among moralists, and that the tropical man must be discredited at all costs, whether as disease and deterioration of mankind, or as his own hell and self-torture? And why? In favor of the temperate zones? In favor of the temperate men? The moral? The mediocre? This for the chapter Morals as Timidity. We can put this more succinctly and more crudely. We need to become more evil. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche dedicates a chapter to the higher man. Zarathustra laments that his message, the coming of the Superman, of the Übermensch, fell on deaf ears when he went down from his mountain to speak to the people at the marketplace. They were not ready for his message. He turns to a different crowd and exhorts them like this: "Have you courage, O brethren? Are you stout-hearted? Not the courage before witnesses, but anchorite and eagle courage, which not even a god can any longer behold. Cold souls, mules, the blind and the drunken, I do not call stout-hearted. He has heart who knows fear, but vanquishes it. He who sees the abyss, but with pride. He who sees the abyss, but with eagle's eyes. He who with eagle's talons grasps the abyss. He has courage." Zarathustra goes on to explain we need to become more evil. "Man is evil, so said to me for consolation all the wisest ones. Ah, if only it be still true today, for evil is man's best force. Man must become better and eviler. So do I teach. The evilest is necessary for the Superman's best. It may have been well for the preacher of the petty people to suffer and be burdened by man's sin. I, however, rejoice in great sin as my great consolation. Such things, however, are not said for long ears. Every word, also, is not suited for every mouth. These are fine faraway things. At them sheep's claws shall not grasp." Taken at face value, it's easy to misconstrue this Zarathustrian message. Perhaps that's also why Nietzsche bothered to include that last sentence, saying that this message is not for everyone. Of course, that's a recurring theme throughout the entire work. Recall how this message gets delivered to a select audience, after Zarathustra is disappointed with how the great mass of men, the men at the marketplace, dismiss his ideas. And the subtitle of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is, of course, a book for all and none. So then, how do we interpret this message of needing to become more evil? In the way we just explained, by taking the so-called evil parts as part of an organic whole, as a necessary component of life, not something to be regarded as a sickness or a detriment, but as something that is a constituent part of the whole economy of life. An ascendant life is therefore, in many ways, an evil life. We are cutting to the meat of the matter now. When Nietzsche critiques the philosophers and psychologists of his time for adhering to one great fallacy that has persisted for centuries, going back all the way to Plato, the belief in antinomies or opposites. Again, the fundamental belief of metaphysicians is the belief in antithesis of values. It never occurred, even to the wariest of them, to doubt here on the very threshold, where doubt, however, was most necessary, though they had made a solemn vow, de omnibus dubitandum, to doubt everything. In spite of all the value which may belong to the true, the positive, and the unselfish, it might be possible that a higher and more fundamental value for life generally should be assigned to pretense, the will to delusion, to selfishness and cupidity. It might even be possible that what constitutes the value of those good and respected things consists precisely in their being insidiously related, knotted, and crotcheted to these evil and apparently opposite things, perhaps even in being essentially identical with them, perhaps. This is the daring perhaps that Nietzsche launches out as the starting point of his proposed psychology and philosophy of the future. What if truth needs error? What if virtue needs vice? What if all these things are related? Would not all philosophy have been a mistake? Would we not have cultivated the wrong gardens, created an imbalance in the economy of life when we seek virtue and try to root out vice? All of philosophy until now has focused on cultivating the truth, and all of psychology has focused on cultivating virtue. What if we needed to cultivate error and vice so that truth and virtue might flourish? That is the dangerous perhaps that Nietzsche proposes, his assignment for the philosophers and psychologists of the future. That is also why Nietzsche rails against the so-called improvers of mankind, most notably in Twilight of the Idols. They divide the human creature into distinct parts, some good, some bad, and they seek to cultivate the good while eliminating the bad. Nietzsche says, first of all, this is impossible, and second of all, the so-called bad parts are just as important to the organism, to life itself, as the good parts. Wherever these so-called improvers of mankind have reared their heads, and Nietzsche singles out the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages in particular, they have not improved mankind, but made it sick. He likens the church and church-like moralities, that is to say, all morality so far, to the taming of wild beasts. Take a look at a domesticated animal, the pug versus the wolf. Has the animal been improved? To call the taming of an animal improving it sounds to our ears almost like a joke. He who knows what goes on in menageries doubts very much whether an animal is improved in such places. It is certainly weakened, it is made less dangerous, and by means of the depressing influence of fear, pain, wounds, and hunger, it is converted into a sick animal. And the same holds good of the tamed man whom the priest has improved. That is Nietzsche's assignment to mankind, to become more dangerous, more evil, and therefore healthier and wilder, more vital, more energetic, more powerful, more barbaric. But we must not lose our humanity on the way there. Again, in fighting monsters, we should see to it that we do not become monsters ourselves. If we gaze into the abyss and look at what lies hidden beneath and confront the darkness that lurks within, we might be tempted to take up arms against whatever monster we find there and fight fire with fire, use monstrous methods against the monster within. But Nietzsche cautions against this. His plea for more evil and more barbarism is not to be taken as permission to indulge in hedonism and wanton destruction. His admonition of virtue does not mean we should engage in orgies of vice. The greatest measure of power is the capacity to resist urges. Yes, we should free ourselves from the shackles of morality and disallow ourselves to be tamed by external moralities and the dictates of the so-called improvers of mankind. But that does not mean we should give in to every earthly drive and urge that we have. Then we simply become slaves to another master. We should reckon with the dark parts of our soul without surrendering to them. To do so is a true measure of power, victory over oneself, self-control, the use of subterraneous energies for the purposes we decide, not the purposes decided by those urges themselves. It's rather a symptom of the weak and decadent to respond to every single stimulus, but it is a sign of the strong and healthy to be able to resist such stimuli. It's the mark of nobility that they do not react. They choose not to react, because they are in control of themselves and their urges. If they engage in debauchery, it is a permitted luxury, because in normal circumstances, they don't allow their base instincts to take over. To look at something tempting and to choose not to react, that is nobility. Just like in chemistry, where noble elements are elements that do not react with other particles. A trivial example is someone who watches their diet and eats healthy foods, and says no to McDonald's every single day in pursuit of a better, stronger body. So what if he has one cheat meal per month and then indulges in fast food? But it's a completely different story if you eat McDonald's every day. Then it becomes a matter of not being able to resist that which is bad for you, and what is a permissible luxury for one becomes a sickness for another. That is the difference between the strong and the weak. Similarly, the strength of someone is measured in how well they can resist stimuli. On the other hand, if you completely remove stimuli, that is also a sign of weakness. For example, Jesus says, "If thine eye offends thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee." But this is weakness, according to Nietzsche. True strength would be to engage in temptation and say no anyway, not remove temptation altogether. Anyone can pluck out their eye, but not everyone can say no to strong temptations. This differentiates the strong from the weak. To pluck out your own eye, literally as well as metaphorically, would be to fight the monster within with monstrous methods, and we would confront our inner darkness, our base animal temptations, with barbarous methods. We would fight the monster by becoming a monster ourselves. That is not strength, says Nietzsche, but powerlessness. The easy way out. The path of least resistance. True will to power ultimately wants resistance. It wants to overcome it. It wants to exercise its strength, not cast it away entirely. So much as Nietzsche encourages us to embrace and reckon with the dark parts of our souls, he also tells us not to let it consume us. The task is rather to look the abyss straight in the eye and not be sucked into its darkness, but to confront the monster at the bottom and make the monster a part of us instead of becoming a complete monster ourselves. That is the meaning of staring into the abyss and fighting monsters without becoming monsters ourselves. The abyss represents the cruel, barbaric, debauched, greedy, envious, impulsive part that lies at the bottom of every soul, that Nietzsche, with his self-proclaimed keen psychological antennae, sought to bring to the forefront of philosophy and psychology, and which his enemies sought to remove from the human organism, trying to improve mankind by cutting away the dark parts of the psyche, and by metaphorically casting out the eye that offends us. But Nietzsche recognized that these so-called evil parts are just as necessary to our well-being as the so-called good parts, and wanted us to confront these baser instincts instead of explaining them away as a sickness or a defect, but to integrate them into a better understanding of the human organism and of life in general. But this integration must happen with powerful measure and great restraint, because to fight the monster with monstrous methods is not a victory at all. It's a capitulation. It's the easy way out and the path of least resistance. It's a surrender to our base instincts. It's a descent into the darkness instead of a climb towards the light. Therefore, when we gaze into the abyss and investigate the dark parts of the human soul, we must be prepared when the abyss gazes back, and when we fight the monster lurking beneath, we must take care not to become the monster ourselves and lose our humanity in the fight. We must come back from the fight not as a monster, but as a more complete human, or rather, as Nietzsche would put it, something more than human, something better than human, something superhuman. Thank you for watching. These videos take a really long while to make, and creating them would be impossible without the help of our Patreons. If you want to support the work we do here, take a look at our Patreon page and consider becoming a member. There are a dozen Patreon exclusive videos waiting for you, as well as book reviews and exclusive conversations with, for example, Essential Salts from the Nietzsche podcast. Of course, a big thank you goes out to our dedicated Patreons, shown here on screen, whose generous support keeps the channel alive. If you can't help out via Patreon, then you can support us greatly by simply subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and if you're so inclined, following us on Twitter, as well as leaving comments, of course, and all that good stuff. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.